in the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, in the Fond of the Navy, under Inventory 12, File 345, there is a document defining the parameters of actions of the Soviet submarine forces in the Baltic Sea in early 1945. This is the combat journal of the Submarine Brigade of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet. On page 78 of this document, an entry from January 30, 1945, is recorded. It states that the submarine S-13, under the command of Captain 3rd Rank Alexander Marinesko, while on combat duty in position number 4, detected a large enemy transport object. The physical condition of the submarine at this point was characterized by a 15% reduction in battery capacity due to prolonged exposure to low temperatures, as well as icing of the bow torpedo tubes. The thickness of the ice crust on the superstructure reached 45 millimeters, which increased the surface displacement and reduced the ship's metacentric height. Before proceeding to a detailed reconstruction of this complex and multifaceted naval operation, I ask you to subscribe to our channel and support its development. Your subscription directly helps us to conduct ongoing research work with archival materials, verify historical data, compare the ship logs of opposing sides, and create detailed, chronologically accurate materials for a thinking audience. Considering the economic and military technical readiness of the parties at the beginning of January 1945, it is necessary to refer to the indicators of German defense logistics within the framework of Operation Hannibal. This operation was initiated by order of Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz on January 21, 1945, due to the breakthrough of the troops of the 2nd and 3rd Belarusian fronts to the Baltic Sea coast. The main goal of the operation was the evacuation of material assets, the wounded, and personnel of military formations from East Prussia. The main logistics hub was designated as the port of Gotenhafen. By January 1945, this port had 12 deep-water berths capable of accommodating vessels with a draft of up to 9 meters. However, the overall throughput capacity was limited by a critical fuel shortage. The strategic reserve of diesel fuel for the needs of the Naval Group East was 30,000 tons, which forced the command to strictly limit fuel consumption. Each large tonnage vessel was refueled only for the voyage to intermediate ports, such as Sassnitz or Swinemünde. One of the main vessels involved in the operation was the passenger liner Wilhelm Gustloff. Built in 1937 at the Blohm and Voss shipyard in Hamburg, the ship had a displacement of 25,484 gross register tons. Its overall length was 208.5 meters, width 23.5 meters, and hull depth 17.3 meters. The propulsion system consisted of 4 8-cylinder MAN diesel engines with a total power of 9,500 horsepower. The vessel's design speed was 15.5 knots. However, by 1945, due to hull fouling and the long absence of dockyard repairs, its maximum speed did not exceed 13 knots. The ship's hull was divided into 12 watertight compartments, equipped with bulkheads with hydraulically operated doors. Since September 1940, the liner had served as a floating barracks for the 2nd Submarine Training Division of the Kriegsmarine, 2 Unterseeboots Lehrdivision. This unit was a key element in the training system for personnel of the German submarine fleet. In Gotenhafen, crews for the newest Type 21 and Type 23 submarines were trained at this division's base. These submarines had a submerged displacement of 1,819 tons and were capable of reaching underwater speeds of up to 17.9 knots due to increased battery capacity and the use of a snorkel. The loss of these specialists meant the elimination of the personnel reserve for 70 to 80 submarines under construction, which deprived Germany of the opportunity to turn the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. By the time of departure, a complex logistical and demographic structure had formed on board the liner. According to the official archival data of the Gotenhafen Port Command, the boarding manifests included 918 officers and cadets of the 2nd U-Boat Training Division, 373 women from the Kriegsmarine Auxiliary Unit, 162 wounded military personnel with severe injuries to limbs and the abdominal cavity, and 4,424 refugees. This reveals the first serious discrepancy in archival sources and an obvious planning error. The German official lists ended at a count of 6,050 people. However, subsequent research, based on a cross-referencing of food distribution card files and the ship's doctor's reports, proves that the actual number of people on board was between 10,300 and 10,582. The planning error was that during the final 24 hours before departure, the port captain allowed women and children from auxiliary boats to board without entering them into the supply and life-saving equipment manifests. This created a deficit of individual life jackets, of which there were only 4,800 units on board, and lifeboat spaces designed for a maximum of 5,200 people. The Soviet submarine S-13 belonged to the 9 bis series. The design was developed under the direction of engineer S.G. Turkov. The submarine's length was 77.7 meters, width 6.4 meters, average draft 4.06 meters. Two 1D diesel engines with a total power of 4,000 horsepower provided surface propulsion, while two PG-72/35 electric motors with a power of 1,100 horsepower provided submerged propulsion. The onboard reserve of diesel fuel was 104 tons. The maximum cruising range on the surface at an economical speed of 9 knots reached 9,800 miles. Mine torpedo armament included 4 bow and 2 stern torpedo tubes of 533 mm caliber. For the attack on January 30th, 1945, Type 53-38 steam gas torpedoes were used. The length of this torpedo was 7.2 meters, total weight 1,615 kilograms, mass of the warhead filled with TNT 300 kilograms. The torpedo had 3 range and speed settings: 4,000 meters at a speed of 44.5 knots, 8,000 meters at 34.5 knots, and 10,000 meters at 30.5 knots. For the attack, the maximum speed setting was chosen, with the torpedo running depth set at 3 meters corresponding to the target's average draft. Let us proceed to an hourly chronological reconstruction of the events of January 30th, 1945. At 0800 hours, work on loading coal for the auxiliary boiler plants and diesel fuel was completed on the liner Wilhelm Gustloff. The air temperature in the port of Gotenhafen had dropped to -10 degrees Celsius. The northerly wind speed was 8 to 10 meters per second. Icing on the deck and davits had reached a critical thickness of 30 millimeters, which blocked the rotation mechanisms of part of the life-saving equipment. At 12:30 hours, 4 port tugs began the operation to tow the liner away from berth number 4. Due to dense, small, broken ice in the port waters, the operation took 45 minutes instead of the standard 15. At 13:15, the Wilhelm Gustloff moved out to the outer roadstead of Gotenhafen and set a course for the exit from Danzig Bay. An atypical and tactically dangerous situation had developed on the ship's bridge, becoming the second major planning error. Command of the ship was effectively divided among 4 individuals: the civilian captain Friedrich Petersen, who was 77 years old, 2 merchant marine captains who were on board as passengers, and the military commander, Captain 3rd Rank Wilhelm Zahn, representing the 2nd Training Division of the submarine force. A fundamental disagreement arose between Petersen and Zahn regarding the choice of route. The military commander Zahn, citing instructions from the Kriegsmarine High Command, insisted on moving along the shallow coastal channel at maximum speed while performing anti-submarine zigzags. He argued that Soviet submarines, due to the risk of running aground, did not operate in depths of less than 20 meters. The civilian Captain Petersen categorically rejected this plan, pointing out that the liner's draft, accounting for overloading, exceeded 6.5 meters, and that the coastal channel had not been cleared of ground mines. Petersen decided to follow the deep water channel number 58, known as the Corridor of the Doomed, which runs north of the Stolpa Bank. At 1400, an escort joined the liner Wilhelm Gustloff. The original plan called for a protective screen of 3 ships. However, due to mechanical failures, the torpedo retriever TF-19 suffered a hull breach after colliding with floating ice and was forced to return to its base in Swinemünde. The detachment was left with only 1 torpedo boat, the Löwe, under the command of Lieutenant Bertram. This ship, built in Norway in 1938 under the name Giller and captured by German forces in 1940, had a displacement of 597 tons and was armed with 3 100mm guns and depth charges. However, its Esgarat hydroacoustic system was malfunctioning due to heavy rolling and the freezing of the receiving antenna in the conditions of a Force 7 storm. Thus, the anti-submarine protection for the huge liner was reduced to a single, technically limited ship, a gross violation of the Kriegsmarine convoy service regulations. At 1800, a radiogram from the Coastal Defense Command arrived on the liner's bridge, reporting that a group of German minesweepers tasked with clearing minefields was moving toward the detachment. To eliminate the risk of collision in limited visibility, which due to snow squalls did not exceed 500 meters, Captain Petersen gave the order to turn on the navigation lights, red and green. This step proved fatal. The lights burned for 1 hour and 20 minutes, allowing observers on Soviet ships and coastal posts to detect the light emission. It was later revealed that the radiogram was erroneous and there were no minesweepers on the route. This discrepancy in the archival documents, the German radio intercept log and the Wilhelm Gustloff's logbook, points to a disorganization within the maritime transport management system in the area of responsibility of Group East. Let us consider the actions of the Soviet submarine S-13. At 1910, Church was on the surface, charging its batteries. Senior Seaman Shalkovsky, performing the duties of a hydroacoustic operator, detected the noise of high-power propellers on a bearing of 120 degrees. Captain 3rd Rank Marinesko made the decision to close in on the source of the noise. The speed of the S-13 was increased to 18 knots. Visual contact with the target was established at 21:10. Due to the severe storm and spray freezing on the periscope glasses and the optical instruments of the coming tower, the initial identification of the target was difficult. Marinesko classified the object as an auxiliary cruiser of approximately 24,000 tons displacement, or a large passenger liner of the Europa type. At 21:15, Marinesko began a tactical maneuver to position for the attack. Instead of a standard attack from the open sea, The commander of the S-13 decided to go around the convoy and attack from the shore side, that is, the liner's port side. This maneuver was fraught with high navigational risk, as the depths in this area decreased to 30 meters, leaving the submarine with a minimal depth margin in case of an emergency dive. However, this calculation proved to be tactically precise. The German observers on the liner Wilhelm Gustloff and the torpedo boat Löwe were focused entirely on the starboard, seaward side, considering the coastal zone to be safe. The approach continued for almost 2 hours. The S-13 moved on the surface using its speed advantage over the liner, which, due to a malfunction in one of its diesel engines, was proceeding at only 12 knots. Here we encounter the third major archival discrepancy. In his subsequent report, Marinesko stated that the target's speed was 18 knots and that the convoy was performing an anti-submarine zigzag. The logbook data from the torpedo boat Löwe completely refutes this. The Wilhelm Gustloff was following a straight course without any changes, as the captains feared the ship being blown by the wind into minefields. Marinesko's speed estimate was inflated due to visual distortions in the stormy weather and the high dynamics of the submarine's own maneuvering. At 23:04, the submarine S-13 arrived at its firing course. The distance to the target was 4.5 cables, approximately 833 meters. The lead angle was calculated using the TAS-1 torpedo fire control computer. At 23:08, Marinesko commanded a salvo from the 4 forward torpedo tubes with a 10-second interval. The crew assigned a symbolic name to each torpedo. The first torpedo, for the motherland; the second, for the Soviet people; the third, for Leningrad; the fourth, for Stalin. The fourth torpedo became stuck in tube number 4 due to a malfunction of the stop mechanism caused by the deformation of the guide rails from icing. The torpedo compartment crew, under the direction of Petty Officer First Class Ivanov, managed to quickly block the tube and prevent the torpedo from detonating spontaneously inside the hull of the boat. The 3 remaining torpedoes successfully left the tubes and sped toward the target. The torpedo run time was 32 seconds. At 23:10, 3 sequential explosions were recorded. The first torpedo struck the bow of the Wilhelm Gustloff directly below the captain's bridge, destroying the bulkheads of the first compartment and disabling the anchor chain system. The second warhead detonated in the area of the E-deck, where the empty swimming pool was located. At that moment, the living quarters of the auxiliary medical and technical staff of the Kriegsmarine, comprised of women, were there. The blast wave and shrapnel from structural elements incapacitated most of the people there instantly. Only 3 out of 373 survived. The third torpedo struck the area of the aft engine room. This explosion was critical to the ship's survivability. The auxiliary diesel generators, which supplied electricity for the pump systems, lighting, and watertight door actuators, were completely destroyed. The liner was plunged into complete darkness within 120 seconds of the explosion. Let us conduct a critical audit of the liner crew's actions based on the Kriegsmarine damage control regulations in effect at the time. Due to the instantaneous loss of electricity, transmitting orders from the bridge became impossible, as the internal broadcasting systems and telephones were inoperative. Captain Peterson gave the order to secure the watertight doors, but due to the lack of power in the hydraulic system, the actuators failed. Sailors tried to close the bulkheads manually, but the increasing influx of water entering through the breach in the engine room at a rate of up to 40 tons per minute blocked the passageways. The condition of the life-saving equipment was of particular importance. Due to the icing mentioned earlier, the left side davits were completely blocked. attempts to chip away the ice with crowbars and axes amid the panic and the list, which had reached 10 degrees to port within 15 minutes of the attack, were unsuccessful. The crew managed to launch only a few lifeboats from the starboard side. Many life rafts were dropped into the water without their lines being secured and were carried away by the storm force wind. The water temperature in the Bay of Danzig was +2 degrees Celsius. Under such conditions, the human body's heat deficit sets in within 5 to 7 minutes, followed by loss of consciousness and cessation of vital functions. At 23:30 hours, the ship's list to port increased to 25 degrees. Passengers located in the interior compartments of the lower deck found themselves trapped due to the destruction of stairways and the jamming of hatches. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that the 37mm anti-aircraft guns mounted on the upper deck broke loose from their mounts and rolled across the icy deck, destroying life rafts and people trying to reach the lifeboats. The torpedo boat Löwe immediately commenced rescue operations, ceasing its anti-submarine search, which also contravened standard instructions that dictated the destruction of the submarine threat first. Lieutenant Bertram gave the order to approach directly alongside the starboard side of the sinking liner. The torpedo boat's crew managed to take 472 people aboard. At 0:15 hours on January 31, 1945, 1 hour and 7 minutes after the first torpedo attack, the passenger liner Wilhelm Gustloff completely capsized to port and sank at a depth of 44 meters at coordinates 55 degrees 7 minutes north latitude and 17 degrees 41 minutes east longitude. By the morning of January 31st, additional German ships involved in Operation Hannibal had arrived at the scene of the sinking. The torpedo boat T-36, the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, 3 minesweepers, and 2 fishing trawlers. Through their combined efforts, according to various archival sources, between 996 and 1,252 people were rescued from the water. Among those saved were all 4 captains who had been on the bridge, including Friedrich Petersen and Wilhelm Zahn, which later served as grounds for an official investigation by the Kriegsmarine Tribunal in Kiel. However, due to the collapse of the Third Reich's judicial system in March 1945, this case never reached a verdict. Considering the consequences and the stark outcome of this operation, it is necessary to turn to the precise statistics of the losses and their impact on the logistical capabilities of the sides. The personnel losses of the 2nd Training Division of the Submarine Force amounted to 406 cadets and officers, including 16 company commanders and leading instructors in hydroacoustics and torpedo fire control. These were specialists who had completed an 18-month course of theoretical and practical training. Their loss dealt an irreparable blow to the human resource potential of the German submarine fleet. A report from the head of the organizational department, dated February 12, 1945, preserved in the Kriegsmarine Headquarters Archive, explicitly states that due to the loss of these specialists in the Bay of Danzig, the commissioning schedules for the new Type 21 submarines at bases in Norway were delayed by at least 3 to 4 months. This deprived the German Navy of the opportunity to conduct its last large-scale submarine operation in the Atlantic, which had been planned for the spring of 1945 to blockade Allied Lend-Lease shipments. The total irrevocable losses resulting from the sinking of the liner Wilhelm Gustloff are estimated by modern military historians and demographers to range from 8,500 to 9,300 people who lost their lives in the icy water. In terms of the number of victims, this disaster became the largest in the history of world shipping. From a military technical point of view, Alexander Marinesko's attack was completely legitimate and effective. The liner Wilhelm Gustloff was not a hospital ship. It did not have the corresponding paint scheme of a white hull with red crosses, was armed with anti-aircraft artillery, and was sailing in an active combat zone with navigation lights on, escorted by a warship. Its status as an auxiliary vessel of the Navy, Wohnschiff, is confirmed by all international rules of naval warfare of that time. The fate of Alexander Ivanovich Marinesko himself after this attack, which was later called the Attack of the Century in Soviet historiography, followed a complex and dramatic trajectory determined by the specifics of his personal qualities and the rigidity of the Soviet administrative command system. In the same patrol, on February 10, 1945, the submarine S-13 carried out another successful attack, sinking the large German transport General von Steuben with a gross register tonnage of 14,660 tons. On board this vessel were about 3,600 military personnel, predominantly wounded and technical specialists of tank units. Thus, during one combat patrol, the crew under Marinesko's command disabled a total of about 40,000 tons of enemy tonnage, which became an absolute record among Soviet submariners. However, instead of being recommended for the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, for which Marinesko was nominated by the commander of the Baltic Fleet, Admiral Tributes, the commander of the S-13, faced opposition from the military counterintelligence organs SMERSH and the party leadership of the brigade. The reason was documented facts of violations of military discipline before departing on the patrol in the Finnish port of Turku, where Marinesko had left his unit without permission for 48 hours, which, in wartime conditions, was classified as desertion. Upon returning from the patrol in March 1945, instead of the highest award, Marinesko was awarded the Order of the Red Banner, and in September of the same year, by order of the People's Commissar of the Navy, Nikolai Kuznetsov, he was removed from command of the submarine, demoted to the rank of senior lieutenant, and transferred to shore duties with the wording for systematic drunkenness and moral degradation. In 1946, Marinesko was discharged into the reserves. His subsequent activities were associated with civilian departments. From 1949, he worked as deputy director of the Leningrad Research Institute of Blood Transfusion. In the same year, he was sentenced to 3 years of imprisonment under the article for squandering socialist property, serving his sentence in the Venino camp in the Far East. This court decision in archival documents is characterized as a consequence of Marinesko's conflict with the institute director, where the accusation was based on the fact of removing several cubic meters of firewood from the institution's territory for personal heating. Alexander Ivanovich Marinesko passed away in 1963 from a severe oncological disease, having been stripped of all types of military benefits and practically forgotten by official Soviet military historiography. Only in May 1990, based on a detailed review of archival cases and under pressure from submarine fleet veterans organizations, by decree of USSR President Mikhail Gorbachev, Alexander Marinesko was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Summarizing the logistical and strategic outcome of S-13's actions, it can be stated that the destruction of the liner Wilhelm Gustloff demonstrated the high effectiveness of the tactic of single cruiser operations by Soviet submarines in the conditions of restricted inland seas. This attack altered the operational tactical situation in the southeastern part of the Baltic Sea, forcing the German command to redirect significant forces of anti-submarine aircraft and escort ships to protect convoys, which weakened German defensive lines in other sectors of the front. The logistical potential of Operation Hannibal was reduced by 15% in terms of the simultaneous evacuation of personnel, as recorded in the final reports of the German Sea Transport Command headquarters for the spring period of 1945. The Wilhelm Gustloff disaster became a technical marker of the complete collapse of the German maritime communications system and demonstrated the Kriegsmarine's inability to ensure the security of its strategic reserves in the final stage of the war. For a detailed understanding of the scale of this attack's destructive impact on the Kriegsmarine's potential, it is necessary to turn to the structure of specialist training among those on board. The 2nd U-Boat Training Division was not merely a training center, but a high-tech cluster. It included specialists of scarce qualifications. Of the 918 career naval servicemen, about 100 were experienced instructors, with combat experience from the 1941 to 1943 Atlantic campaigns. They were proficient in the operational methods of the latest radar systems, such as the FUMO-61 Hohentuel and the circular viewing sonar Balkongerät. The destruction of this corps of personnel resulted in a situation where there was no one to conduct commissioning and primary sea trials of detection systems on the Type 21 submarines under construction in Danzig and Elbing. Shipyard logistical reports indicate that in February 1945, the readiness for handover to the fleet of 12 submarine hulls was frozen precisely due to the absence of certified specialists in the acceptance crews. Let us analyze the hydrological and navigational situation in the Stolpe Bank area, which had a decisive influence on the maneuvering parameters of S-13. This navigational area is characterized by a sharp depth change from 60 to 12 meters. In the winter period, a specific temperature stratification of water forms here, a thermocline located at a depth of 15 to 18 meters. This layer significantly distorts signals from hydroacoustic stations, creating zones of acoustic shadow. Senior Red Fleet sailor Shalkovsky, using the Mars-12 noise direction finding station, managed to isolate a stable audio signal from the Wilhelm Gustloff's propellers precisely at the moment when the liner crossed the thermocline boundary, which testifies to the high professional level of the Soviet operator. The German hydroacoustic operator on the destroyer Löwe, using the S-Gerät system, was at a disadvantage. Due to heavy rolling, the amplitude of the roll reached 15 degrees, and air bubbles drawn under the ship's hull. The effective detection range of the noises from the Soviet submarine decreased from the specified 2,000 meters to a critical 300 meters. An important aspect is the ballistic and hydrodynamic calculation of the torpedo strike. The Type 5 3-38 torpedoes, launched by S-13, had a total explosive mass in the salvo of 900 kilograms. The explosion occurred at a depth of 3 meters below the waterline, causing instantaneous destruction of the 18-millimeter thick hull plating made of carbon steel grade ST-42. The hydrodynamic shock led to deformation of the liner's longitudinal hull framing over a length of 45 meters. The first torpedo completely destroyed the bulkhead between the first and second watertight compartments. The ingress of seawater into the bow compartments amounted to about 25 tons per second. This caused an instantaneous bow trim, which 5 minutes after the explosion reached 3 degrees, hindering the movement of people through the corridors on C and D decks. The second torpedo, which struck the pool area, pierced the E deck and caused the destruction of the bulkheads in compartment number 4. The specific design of this space involved large open areas which facilitated the rapid spread of water without encountering resistance. The female naval auxiliary personnel stationed here were trapped. The heavy watertight doors of adjacent compartments were jammed in a half-open position due to the deformation of their frames from the blast wave, making it impossible to ensure the local survivability of the compartment. Water filled the space within 90 seconds, eliminating any chance of evacuation. The third torpedo struck in the area of compartment number 7, which housed the auxiliary boiler room and the power system distribution boards. The explosion destroyed the 220-volt AC main cables and the 110-volt DC distribution equipment. As a result, the emergency lighting, powered by battery banks, lasted only 3 minutes before failing due to a short circuit caused by the flooding of the liner's battery compartment. The dewatering turbopumps, each with a capacity of 600 cubic meters per hour, were also left without power. The ship lost its technical ability to pump out water, which predetermined the rate of its flooding. Examining the actions of the liner's command through the lens of the Kriegsmarine Convoy Service Regulations, M.DV. Number 190, it is necessary to note the complete failure to execute safety protocols under the threat of a submarine attack. After registering the explosions, Captain Peterson made an error by ordering the ship to stop. According to regulatory requirements, a damaged ship is obligated to maintain the highest possible speed to preserve the effectiveness of steering and to reduce the dynamic pressure of incoming water on undamaged bulkheads. Stopping the liner resulted in it becoming a stationary target, and the flooding rate through the breaches increased by 20% due to a change in the vector of hydrodynamic wave pressure. Of particular interest are the archival data from the investigation initiated by the Maritime Court in Kiel on February 5, 1945. The interrogation transcripts of the surviving third officer of the liner, Harry Kohler, recorded that organizational chaos reigned on the bridge during the attack. The civilian navigators did not obey the commands of the military advisor Zahn, and Zahn himself lacked accurate data on the distribution of rescue equipment by station. For instance, the keys to the lockers containing individual life jackets were held by the chief steward, who fell in battle in the first minutes after the explosion in the area of the stern distribution board. Consequently, thousands of passengers on the upper decks were left without flotation devices, while the storage rooms on B deck remained locked until the ship went under. The rescue operation launched by the German side is also documented with serious contradictions. The logbook of the destroyer T-36 states that the ship arrived at the disaster site at 23:45 and was immediately attacked by a Soviet submarine, forcing it to maneuver and deploy depth charges. However, Marinesko notes in his log that after the attack, the S-13 immediately descended to a depth of 50 meters and set a withdrawal course northward, without making repeated runs on the target. This discrepancy indicates that the commander of the T-36 mistook floating debris from the liner's rigging or torpedo tracks for a submarine periscope, leading to the wasteful expenditure of 12 depth charges and the loss of 15 minutes, during which the ship could have been pulling people from the water. The material losses of the German side were not limited to personnel and tonnage. Along with the Wilhelm Gustloff, the warehouses of precision optical equipment evacuated from the laboratories of Gotenhofen sank to the bottom, including 40 sets of periscopes for Type 21 submarines manufactured by the Carl Zeiss plant in Jena. This loss was recorded in the quarterly report of Albert Speer's Ministry of Armaments for the first quarter of 1945 as a critical disruption in the supply of components for the shipbuilding program. The shipyards in Bremen and Hamburg were forced to install outdated types of periscopes on the boats under construction, which reduced their combat effectiveness by 30%. The impact of Marinesko's actions on the overall strategic situation is confirmed by the change in the routes of German convoys. After January 31, 1945, the Kriegsmarine Command completely closed Deepwater Route number 58 to the movement of single transports without destroyer-class escorts. All subsequent evacuation voyages were redirected along shallow water coastal routes under the cover of coastal artillery batteries. This increased the transit time from Gotenhafen to Swinemünde from 18 to 36 hours, which, under the conditions of the rapid offensive of Soviet troops, led to the disruption of evacuation schedules for approximately another 45,000 people remaining encircled in the Danzig area. Reviewing the service records of Alexander Marinesko, kept in the main personnel directorate of the Navy, a clear correlation between his disciplinary record and career advancement can be traced. The documents show that the S-13 under his command conducted 6 combat patrols during the entire war period, carried out 5 torpedo attacks, which resulted in the confirmed sinking of 2 large tonnage units. In the performance report from June 1944, signed by the brigade commander of submarines, Karnikov, Marinesko is characterized as a decisive, tactically competent commander prone to unjustified risk in non-combat situations. The presence of 2 strict reprimands in his personal file for violating curfew and unauthorized contacts with foreign citizens in home ports became the key factor that blocked his nomination for the title of Hero of the Soviet Union in 1945, despite the obvious military tactical success of the operation. The bottom line of the historical and archival analysis shows that the attack of the century was a natural result of the superiority of Soviet tactics for employing submarine forces in coastal waters over the disorganized and resource-deficient German anti-submarine defense system in the final stage of the war. The violation of convoying principles, the divided command on the liner's bridge, the German side's disregard for meteorological factors, and the precise execution of maneuvers by the Soviet crew led to the complete elimination of the strategic personnel reserve of the German submarine fleet, altering the balance of power in the maritime theater of operations.